Beste kijker van de Nieuwe Wereld, we gaan iets nieuws doen, themagesprekken. In samenwerking met Pakhuis de Zwijger, de Vrije Universiteit en Moral Markets gaan we met wereldwijd gerenommeerde economen het hebben over de vraag: hoe ziet de toekomst van het kapitalisme eruit? Deze gesprekken kan je vanaf nu volgen bij de Nieuwe Wereld. Ik wens je veel plezier.
Thank you, Natasja. And thank you as well, Professor Anderson, for being here with us tonight. First off, the title of tonight is Free Markets and Inequality, an Inescapable Marriage. Do you agree with that?
I wanted to comment on the concept of free markets. It's widely misunderstood. Every market requires extensive regulations, even to get off the ground. There are constitutive features of markets, rules of the game by which people have to play. Some of these are set by the state, but usually in any market, there's considerably additional regulations that determine the rules of the game. Often when people speak of free markets, what they want is the state to minimize regulation. But in practice, what that means is the power to construct the additional rules that govern that market is handed over to the most powerful economic agent. And that I find fundamentally problematic, because that agent invariably write the rules of exchange in its own interests and at the expense of counterparties. So that's a fundamental disagreement I have, is that there have to be lots of regulations in any market. And the question is, who is going to make those regulations? Will it be the state, which in a democratic order is accountable to the people? Or will it be the most powerful actors, economic actors, those with the most wealth or perhaps a monopoly position who exercise market power? In order to constitute markets justly, I think we need a robust role for the state to set the rules of the game fairly, and also to think very seriously about market power and regulations needed to minimize market power, for instance, through antitrust regulation.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Very interesting question. I think we'll come back to that later in the discussion tonight. Looking forward to moving into more depth about that as well. Ms. Anderson, just to set the scene for tonight a little bit more, in your book, Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives, you mentioned that firms are political in a sense. What do you mean by that?
Well, government exists whenever you have some people in a position to give orders to other people that they disobey on pain of some sanction. And on that very capacious notion of government, then every firm is a government, because you have managers giving orders to workers, and the workers could be punished by being fired or demoted or harassed in various ways if they don't follow those orders. So then if we ask, well, what is the typical constitution of the government of the firm? At least in the United States, the constitution of the firm is fundamentally a dictatorship or maybe an oligarchy, in which the governed, that is the workers, have no power. So they don't have any rights of participation in that government, even though they're ruled by it. And that's really the source of domination within the workplace in a formation that I call private government.
So in your book, for example, you use Ronald Coase's theory of the firm, for example, and you illustrate that firms are kind of small command centers, command economies, where contracts intentionally, for example, leave vague the exact duties of work. And you seem to imply that this vagueness is not accidental, because it almost always seems to benefit the employer. How does this vagueness, for example, in these contracts benefit the employer or the upper party?
I just want to stress that any well-run organization is going to have to leave a lot of room for discretion in order to get its business done. So you can't have a completely minutely specified contract that's really efficient for productive purposes, because there's always unanticipated circumstances you're going to have to rally workers around to solve problems that weren't already anticipated and written into the contract. The difficulty is that, at least in the American context, the terms of the employment contract are so open-ended that they give power to employers to regulate workers' lives in ways that really have no efficiency rationale whatsoever. Or if it has an efficiency rationale, employers have the right to regulate workers' lives that severely impair other essential freedoms, the right to privacy and so forth, that it's important to protect both on duty and off duty. But in the US context, a worker could be fired for instance, taking a political position off duty or endorsing a candidate that the boss doesn't like. There are no protections against that. So you could be fired for your off-duty behavior or off-duty recreation behavior, choice of marriage and sexual partners, all kinds of things that workers take for granted that they ought to be able to do without the scrutiny or sanction of their employer could lead to job loss in the American context. So we have an open-end kind of power that bosses have over their workers, and innumerable cases in which they've exercised that power, even though there's not even a remote hint of economic rationale for it.
Isn't this an extreme example, or is this more common than we tend to think it is?
In fact, it's extremely common. So a very large percentage of American workers are subject to suspicionless drug testing. They have every word monitored, every keystroke monitored, even when they're on breaks. They can have their phone conversations with their family monitored if it takes place within the office. We see a regime of comprehensive surveillance and minute control of innumerable workers at work. And these are not isolated. We're talking about large percentages of American workers are subject to this kind of regulation.
So many workers actually lead lives of quiet desperation, coerced by their lack of bargaining power and some harsh or perhaps sadistic bosses?
Oh, absolutely. For instance, let's just take the example of sexual harassment. Almost all workers who suffer sexual harassment keep their silence. Why? Because there's no possibility of getting any justice within the system. In fact, the vast majority of harassment lawsuits that are filed in the United States are actually for retaliation rather than for the original harassment, because they get fired if they complain. Well, it's known to workers that they'll get fired if they complain about conditions, so no wonder conditions are awful. And it's not just sexual harassment. There's all kinds of that goes on at the workplace, and there's no regulations against that as long as the boss isn't discriminating in the bullying behavior. It can go on, and there's no workers have no recourse under the law at all for that.
Yeah. So what can we do to make sure that market relations become more voluntary or more equal, so to speak?
Well, I do think that here's a place where the United States could learn something from some European practices. I think that we have to reform the constitution of the government of the workplace and elements of democracy. And it's high time, for instance, the United States started experimenting seriously with models of co-determination, which were pioneered in Germany. And we also need to strengthen labor unions, which are the fundamental basis which workers can complain about work conditions and still have protection from getting fired for the mere act of complaining.
So are any of these ideas, because as you mentioned, they are very embedded within the American context, are some of the ideas you mentioned applicable to the European context as well? Or is it just possible that you could learn from the European context? And there's nothing
well,
wrong with that.
One of the phenomena that we see across many capitalist countries is the rise of precarity. Some are temporary workers, 0 hours contract workers, and these people are incredibly vulnerable. So even the minutest kind of unsatisfactory behavior from the manager's point of view could lead to job loss or not enough hours to support oneself. And so that also, I think, makes many workers in Europe as well as the United States vulnerable to arbitrary and abusive treatment by their employers because they have such a continuous connection to the party who's directing their labor.
Yeah. So we started off this interview by asking the question, is it an inescapable marriage, free markets and inequality? And I'd like to ask you as a closing question, Ms. Professor Anderson, is this idea of this coercion in work, how should we regulate that? How should we build, for example, regulation around that? Should it be coming from within firms themselves or from governments, politicians, and who is going to do that?
I think we have to design the constitution of the government of the firm to empower workers to have a voice in management. And that's critical. So what I would say is it isn't inevitable. There's not an inevitable marriage between markets and inequality, but you have to get the regulations right, and you have to have regulations that empower the parties who in the current system are relatively weaker, and you have to have regulations that break up concentrations of power, such as we see, for instance, in technology, where we have companies that completely dominate high tech, right? There has to be antitrust.
Thank you, Professor Anderson. Thank you for your answers. We'll come back to that. Looking forward to the discussion later on in this evening. But let's move on to the next part of the show.
Yes, and that's the in-depth interview with Professor Francois Bourguignon, again by David van Overbeek.
Thank you, Natasja. Professor Bourguignon, thank you very much for being here tonight as well. Tonight's title, Free Markets and Inequality, an Inescapable Marriage. Do you agree with that?
Roughly, yes. But I believe that you need to introduce many nuances in this statement. We had markets for many, many years. If we go back to Second World War, we had markets ever since then, but for 30 years, inequality didn't change. And it is true that we started to see some increase in inequality, in income inequality. I'll come back to what inequality is about. Mm-hmm. At the time of the so-called liberal revolution, which was undertaken by, in particular, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the US. And it is true that we observed that inequality started to increase in the US and in the UK exactly at that time. Continental Europe, it was a different story. So this means that certainly the deregulation that took place in those days, which to some extent made markets freer, played a role in the increase in inequality. But there are other factors which played a big role. Globalization was certainly a huge factor in increasing inequality, basically by providing or by modifying the allocation of total income between capital and labor. Capital benefited much more than labor from globalization, and labor, to some extent, was hurt by globalization. And another factor which is quite important is technology. So to say that deregulation is more important than globalization or is more important than technology is difficult to say. Moreover, we can see that the three factors play together, and that the structure of markets is affecting the change in technology, and the structure of the market is affecting and is affected by globalization.
Yes.
So roughly, yes, I agree with the fact that freer markets is generating in general more inequality, but the channels are maybe a bit different.
Yeah, so it's deregulation, globalization, technology, all of these forces, you need to combine them together to explain for this rise in inequality in some countries, you mentioned. Just to get...
Yeah, I would like to add something on inequality. I think it is quite important to make a distinction between what we call market income inequality. That is, this is inequality in the incomes that are generated by the market. Labor, wages, dividends, capital gains, etc. And what we can call disposable income inequality, which is the same inequality after taxes and transfers and all kinds of benefits which are being given to people at the bottom of the market income distribution.
Yeah.
And what happens is that we observe that in many countries, in most advanced countries, there was an increase in market income inequality at least until the beginning or maybe the mid-2000s, maybe until the crisis of 2008. Then it stopped, except in the US. And at the same time, observe that disposable income inequality didn't behave in the same way. And the disposable income inequality has been much flatter over time than market income inequality. This is quite important because it shows that the redistribution system is able to correct the inequalities that are directly generated by the market.
Yes, thank you. A very good distinction. So one of the other things that caught my attention when reading your book is that you say factual measures of data and statistics don't always rhyme with prevailing popular opinion. As you mentioned in your book in 2015, most Americans did not believe that inequality had risen over the last years in their country, despite evidence pointing in the other direction. Has this changed over time? Do people in America and Europe agree now more that there has been a rise in inequality, as you just mentioned?
I'm not sure, but Elizabeth Anderson might have a better position to answer that question. But I don't think that this has changed quite a lot in the US. The point is, the main point in the US is that the way the public opinion is looking at inequality is not by looking at income, current income inequality. It is more by looking at opportunities. And for a long time, some sociologists say that things are changing, but for a long time, the American public opinion saw that this was a land of completely open opportunities, yes. Free opportunities. And academics know that this is not the case. But there is still this kind of illusion in the mind of many American people. So it was quite interesting to see that this increase in inequality, that big increase in inequality, that income inequality that was observed in the US didn't trigger big reactions, basically because people kept living on the illusion that there was some equality of opportunities.
Yeah.
In Europe, things are slightly different. I would say that Europeans are putting much more emphasis on income inequality, and to some extent, too much emphasis. And I can tell you, public opinion, public polls, not a long time ago, showed that in the Netherlands and in France, many people, more than half of the population, thought that inequality had increased over the last 10 or 15 years, whereas this was not true. At least looking, as I said before, to disposable income.
Yes.
So this means that there is illusion, and we are not clear about what kind of inequality people are referring to when they say that inequality has increased. And I would like to take as an example the point that Elizabeth Anderson made about the condition of workers and the fact that there may be a lot of inequality among different firms because the status or the condition of the freedom of workers is not the same. So this kind of inequality in working conditions is something that we are not really capturing statistically, but which may be something that the people have in mind when they refer to inequality.
Yeah.
This is a difficulty with this concept of inequality, is that it is seen in different ways by different people, and statisticians and economists are able only to measure one particular set of inequality concepts.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Bourguignon. I think that it's very interesting. You mentioned this myth or this illusion that people hold with regard to their own situation, whether in Europe or in America, when you compare it to the facts. And in this series, we're trying to reimagine capitalism, which also means taking a critical perspective with regard to our own presuppositions, you could say. In your book, you mentioned another one. You actually take arms against this idea of a general trade-off between an efficient economy and a just one. I want to ask you, is an unequal society or economy also an unjust society? And why do you think, or economy, and why do you think that's the case?
Okay, I mean, I would say that an unequal, if there is excessive inequality in a country, I would certainly not call that country just or fair. Now, the issue, because we need a minimum inequality in order to generate incentives for people to develop, to innovate or to work or to make efforts or to take risk in order to build new firms, etc. So we need some minimum inequality. But too much inequality, and this is, I believe, the main point, is certainly unfair. But more than that, and I believe this is the important point in the book, more than that, we know that excessive inequality is inefficient in the sense that this is making the economy work much less well than it could work with a more egalitarian distribution. So this is the way in which I'm saying that there is no trade-off really between inequality or equality and efficiency. To some extent, too unequal society will in general become an inefficient society. Yeah. And there are reasons to think about, to believe that this is the case.
Yes. Last question.
All this goes through inequality of opportunity.
Thank you. Last question, Professor Bourguignon. So how can greater equality accelerate GDP growth, and how can we make sure that the right people prosper from a growth in GDP?
Okay, first, we want to make sure that the produce of GDP growth is distributed in a fair way in the population. If you look at the American economy, which is, other economies are not doing that well. So, but the point with the US is that it is a kind of a typical case. It is an iconic case. Mm-hmm. But if you look at growth in the United States over the last 30 years, then we show that 80 to 90% of the total produce of growth has gone to the top 10% of the population. When you look at the median household in the US, over the last 30 years, the increase in the standard of living of this median household has been a few percentage points in 30 years, when the economy, when GDP per capita has been growing at least 1% every year over the last 30 years. So here you see that certainly growth has been extremely inegalitarian in the United States. Now, what should you do for growth to be egalitarian? You should intervene trying to modify the structure of the economy. And as it was said before, you want probably to regulate many parts of the economy. In particular, you want to make sure that antitrust laws are working correctly. You want to eliminate too much market power in several sectors, not only the high-tech sectors, but practically in all sectors of the economy. So this is intervening upstream in the way the economy works. Yeah. It can also intervene downstream, saying because the economy is not working well enough, we will be correcting by taxes and redistribution. A very important point that is to be emphasized and stressed is the fact that over time, in most countries, the tax system has become less and less and less progressive. Today we see the top 1% of the population in many economies, the market income going, the proportion going to that people increasing enormously. It is possible to correct that with the appropriate tax rate. But in societies where tax rate has been being reduced year after year, then of course this is not possible. And the only way redistribution inequality has been contained or has not been growing faster in the US is basically because very much has been done at the bottom in order to try to help all those people who are in precarious conditions, all those people who are at the limit of getting a job or not getting a job. This is where the redistribution and the fight against inequality has taken place. Yeah. But we should not forget about the top.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Bourguignon. Let's see if we can help those people at the bottom in the precarious positions during this discussion. Let's move over to the next part of tonight.
Yeah, and that part is actually the open debate round, where the speakers are just invited to respond to each other. And we will also pose some questions the audience actually has for you. But before we do that, I would like to invite Professor Anderson to respond, of course, to Professor Bourguignon. What's your first line of thought when you heard him speaking?
Oh, I don't think actually that we disagree about thought. I think we have a lot of agreement here. I do agree that some measure of inequality is necessary for markets to function, but it doesn't have to be nearly as much as, certainly not remotely as much as what we see in the United States today, or even starting in the 1970s. Mm. The evidence suggests that you can have much lower degrees of inequality and even have a more efficient and productive economy than what we see in the United States. I want to comment on equality of opportunity and why that has been historically such a powerful notion in the United States. It comes from the fact that such a huge percentage of the American population is immigrants. Mm. And the one place where the United States very consistently has dramatically improved people's standard of living is by just letting people in. It's a very consistent experience of immigrants that they, when they come to the United States, they experience much better opportunities than the country from which they came. And so their income leaps as a result of that. Immigration is the main contribution that the United States makes to reducing global inequality. Now, of course, we have a president now who's trying to clamp down on that and has actually wreaked havoc on the immigration system. But even to this very day, notwithstanding the last 4 years, it remains the case that immigrants overall tend to have a very successful experience in the United States. And that's what leads Americans with so much immigration in their past. My grandparents came from Europe to the United States.
Yeah.
And they all experienced this as America's a land of opportunity. And for immigrants in many respects, even to this day, it still is. And so that creates the illusion that America is a land of opportunity because it's a kind of historical lag. People aren't catching up to the memories, basically, that their grandparents and parents have.
And of course, it's also the American dream is also something which inspires you, but also aspires you to do better. So I can imagine it's a powerful myth. But let me ask you a question by the audience, Johan Graafland, who asks about this discussion about both of you mentioned that some inequality is necessary, and he asks you, where do you hold the threshold? He asks, is inequality a matter of justice if basic rights are respected in society? It's a nice philosophical question, I think, Professor Anderson, and then perhaps we can also go to you, Mr. Bourguignon. Professor Bourguignon. Professor Anderson, please. Is it, if basic needs are met, is it still a question of justice?
Well, I think there is a real question of justice concerning the structure of opportunities for acquiring income and wealth. My dissertation advisor was John Rawls, who wrote A Theory of Justice back in the 1970s. He had a pretty reasonable response. He said inequalities need to be shown to redound to the advantage of everyone. And there are some inequalities that will do so. In fact, you can find that criterion all the way back to the French Revolution. You can tolerate inequalities that are to everyone's advantage. There will be some, because you do need some degree of incentives to get markets working well.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be nearly the extent that we see in the United States today.
Yeah. Is that the difference principle?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can imagine it's great to write a thesis with John Rawls as a promoter. Yes, so that's the question. But then let us reflect a bit on the mechanism you both we would like to investigate, and that is, you say that some amount of inequality is necessary, but the amount of inequality we now see, for instance, in the US, is not productive and even not benefiting an efficient or well-functioning economy. Can you elaborate on that a bit, Mr. Bourguignon?
Yes. I would like to tell you about an anecdote. I mean, when I was in the World Bank, I visited very often China. China was doing extremely well in terms of growth, but they were doing extremely badly, or well, I don't know what word to use, in terms of inequality, because inequality was growing very, very fast. So I was telling them, look, you must be very careful, because if you let inequality go up too much, then at some stage it will become a negative factor for economic growth.
Yeah.
Then they understood the argument, and then the question was, could you tell us exactly at what level this coefficient of inequality should be for us to take action against inequality? And of course, this is exactly this question that you are asking. How much is a reasonable level of inequality, and how much is excessive inequality? There is no rigorous answer to that question, because it depends on too many parameters.
Yeah.
But yes, we have the feeling that when after many years of stable inequality, we see inequality is increasing enormously, it is very hard to believe that there is not something wrong going on. And that if the issue was only to maintain the incentives of people in order to generate the resources that is needed by the collectivity, then if suddenly we see inequality going up that much, there must be something wrong. And I don't think that we can go much beyond this kind of argument. But I would like to come back on one point, which was the equality of opportunities and the inequality of income. There is in the economic literature a very interesting curve, which we call the Gatsby curve, referring to the John Fitzgerald, novel of Gatsby. And this curve shows that there is a very strong correlation between the inequality of opportunities as measured by the intergenerational, or the correlation between the earnings of fathers and earnings of parents and earnings of children. And there is a big correlation between this inequality of opportunities, in the sense that the income or the earnings of one generation depends on the parents, and current inequality of income. So inegalitarian countries in terms of opportunities are inegalitarian in terms of income. So this is interesting in the sense that it shows that there is a direct link between those two concepts, and probably the way to correct inequality is to try to equalize opportunities as much as possible. And this goes through education, this goes through taxation on inheritance, and this kind of thing. There are many ways we can do that. Now the point is probably that we don't do that enough. And the last remark I wanted to make about what has been discussed earlier, and this reference to the French motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité.
Yes.
I think it is quite important to keep in mind that the equality that those people had back in the time of the French Revolution was not the vertical inequality we are referring to today. It was much more horizontal inequality, in the sense that people should be facing the same treatment in the society. There cannot be any kind of discrimination between gender. There cannot be any discrimination between races, between different age groups. All people should have the same possibilities, should have the same rights. And this is this equality that the revolutionaries insisted upon. And I believe this is, again, another dimension of inequality, which is quite important today. And when we want to analyze, for example, the populist movements in many countries, I think it is important to keep in mind that this kind of horizontal inequality is important. For example, we observe in the US, in the UK, in France, that the populist votes in those countries are very much related to a distinction between small cities and big metropolis. People who are left in small cities which are decaying, and people who are living in a very dynamic context in big cities. This is a typical horizontal inequality that may be more important than the vertical income inequality, and the fact that some people are earning much more than others.
Connie is asking a question related to that, one of the people in the audience. I don't have a last name, but she asks you, Professor Bourguignon, the question, do you agree that equal rights, she quotes, in an unequal society enlarge social inequalities?
I'm not sure I understood the question. I mean, unequal rights or equal rights?
Do you agree, she asks, that focusing on equal rights in an unequal society enlarges social inequalities?
Yeah, the issue with the... I'm sure that Professor Anderson has very much to say about this.
Yeah, we'll go to her.
The point is that it is very difficult to oppose rights and actual possibilities. I may have the right to do things. I may have the right to work, but what do I do with the right to work if there is no work in the society where I'm living?
Clear.
And there is a kind of tension between rights and realities and actual outcomes. Let's say rights and outcomes. And I'm not sure that we should simply stick by equal rights and to say, because we have decided that rights were the same for everybody in the society, we are living in an equal society. This is not true. The point is that we have to put rights in front of the rights that can be exerted and those which cannot be exerted.
Professor Anderson.
You can't do everything with rights, okay? Rights are fundamental. They're a foundation of a free society, but you also just have to have sound policies and also a pretty robust system of public investment. One of the things that's happened in the United States is an awful lot of shrinking of the state and reduction of its capacity to invest in public goods. We have a decaying infrastructure. We're not transitioning effectively to a zero carbon economy. We need just massive public investment that isn't happening, and our schools are decaying, and our healthcare system is monopolized and exploitative. So we just there's a whole panoply of policies that call rights that nevertheless are absolutely indispensable to creating a more just and equal society, and frankly, a more efficient one. It's simply not efficient to have an economy in which workers get sick because their safety isn't protected at work and we have pollution everywhere. That's not efficient. And then you waste money on the hospital system. It might technically increase GDP, but that's not a good way to increase human welfare.
Mm-hmm. Should we aim, Professor Anderson, should we aim for GDP growth, or should we aim for something else more perhaps in line with what Kate Raworth's donut economy boils down to?
Look, I do think that especially in America, we obsess over GDP growth at the expense of other measures of human well-being. So the United States, for instance, among whites in the United States, we see declining life expectancy. It's shocking. What? We're an unbelievably wealthy country, and people are living less long. This is a serious crisis, right? And we have a catastrophe with our public health agencies, with the United States having one of the worst records in the world dealing with the pandemic. We need a much more robust state capacity than we have. And unfortunately, we have an administration that's been gung-ho for destroying the capacity of the state to deliver any goods. We can't even run a competent census. We can't run even a post office. And we're talking about basic public services are decaying in the United States.
But before we can talk an entire evening about defunctioning institutions in the US.
I mean, there is not only in the US.
No, exactly.
No, I mean, the point I wanted to make and to answer the question is the fact that GDP is not an indicator of social welfare.
No.
It is an indicator of the level of economic activity. And we may believe, or we may expect, that higher GDP from a year to the next will correspond to a better life for several people in the economy. But we cannot be sure that everybody will be benefiting from it. And over the long run, we certainly want to take into account other aspects of welfare, individual and social welfare. The example of life expectancy is very good. On top of that, we know that life expectancy is going down in the US, not because everybody has less life expectancy, but because a particular group of people are dying much earlier than it was the case before. And they are dying because they are in difficult and very precarious situations.
Yes.
This is a very, very important element that we want to take into account, and it is not clear that it is well captured by inequality figures. But this typically is the kind of thing that we want to take into account. A few years ago, there was a commission, which was the initiative of the French president, and the head of the commission were Joe Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, and and French economist Fitoussi. I was part of that commission, and this commission produced a report which is called Beyond GDP.
Yes.
And insisting on the fact that statistical institutes should go beyond measuring GDP. I mean, the point to say, which is to say everything is fine because GDP is increasing, this is wrong. And we have many examples of that, not only in the US, I mean, in all countries of the world.
Yes, thank you, Professor Bourguignon. I have a question for Professor Anderson. You just mentioned that we don't only need laws or policies, but we also need something else. And during this series, we're trying to reimagine capitalism, which is also trying to take note of some of the presuppositions that we hold, perhaps some of the myths in capitalism that we hold, but which are actually debunkable. Now, you could say that sometimes this inequality is justified, and this is also a question from our audience, because these rich billionaires, they also contribute to society because of the innovations that they hold and the jobs they create for people. Do you think that is a myth? And if so, how can we debunk it?
Look, it's absolutely a myth. To whom do you attribute job creation? Jobs come from interaction of many elements, including consumer demand, right? So you can't just attribute it to the CEO of the corporation. We also have macroeconomic policy. Is the central banking system running policies to create a tight job market or not? There are many factors that enter into this. And I am very much disinclined to credit the leading tech companies in the United States with as much productivity as their income. Look at the incredible destructive effects they've actually had. Facebook, for instance, has destroyed American newspapers at the local level. There's no more local news left, okay? And what that means is it's actually been measured. The cost to municipalities, small cities who don't have a newspaper, of borrowing money to pay for essential infrastructure, even like repairing the streets, the interest they have to pay rises when there is not a local newspaper. Why? Because lenders, creditors suspect that when there's no press who's supervising the activities of the local government, some kind of corruption is likely to go on, and self-dealing and contracts that are overpaid in order to get votes from powerful business people in the locality. So everybody pays more money because Facebook has a relative monopoly on advertising revenue that's destroyed local papers. But it's worse than that. They're undermining democracy. The Facebook feeds are pumping propaganda and conspiracy theories, to everybody's Facebook feed, right? And the country's going. There are other things besides looking at their profits to determine whether they're actually adding value to people's lives.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of problems with that assumption.
Yeah, and you could even say that the commission that was headed by Stiglitz for the French government, which proposed a broader definition of well-being instead of focusing on the GDP. And in our country, the Netherlands, we also have now a new framework, right? It's called broader well-being as a measurement beyond GDP. You could also look at companies like that, right? Not focusing only on the profits, but on the general attribution to other values for society. We started this conversation with a column of Jim Suri, right? And in a few minutes, I'm going to invite him to join us to reflect on that. But one of the things he said was that for him, creating a more just world or a more equal world, it would also talk about dematerialization of consumption. And we already talked a bit about natural environment, the impact on climate change and the lack of climate policy. But Marije Schaafsma, who's also watching, is asking us to reflect a bit on that as well. So on the definition of consumption, dematerialization, and she asks, what is the relationship between inequality and the natural environment? Professor Bourguignon, would you like to tell what you are thinking when you hear a question like that?
Okay, I would say that it would depend very much on which country we are looking at. If we look at some developing countries, poor people are making a lot of damage in the environment, for example, by burning forests or tumbling trees. And at the same time, you can say that those people in the Amazon who are burning the Amazon forest in order to grow more soya or whatever are also destroying the environment. Now, you can see that there is some behavior against the environment on both ends of the income scale. So it's difficult to say that inequality per se is generating more environmental damage. And the main point about the environmental damage is really a global issue. So we cannot say that, and the total emission of CO2, which is really the big issue of the environment today and for the next few centuries, is a global issue and this time depends on GDP, or depends also on the structure of GDP, but depends on the size of GDP. And this is a very difficult issue. For example, let me take another example at the international level. The Chinese are a big polluter in the world. Now they say, look, we are a big polluter because we are producing goods which are coming with a lot of CO2 emission. And we're producing those goods which were produced by advanced countries before. And we're producing those goods which are consumed by advanced countries' consumers. So who is responsible for the pollution? Is it the final consumption, or is it the producers in several emerging countries? And you see that this has a direct impact on inequality, because China is still much less rich than the United States or than Europe. So because of that, I believe that this issue of inequality and pollution is a difficult, and I'm not sure this is the right question to be asked. It is something else. The right question might be to say, if we want to reduce pollution, if we want to reduce CO2 emission, will this have an impact on inequality within the country? Will it be the case that some people will be more affected by this kind of ecological policies than other people? And we might possibly say something about this, but I don't think that there is any general rule about this. About the definition of consumption, it depends very much on what people want to consume. But we are still living in a world where there is a huge proportion of the population which needs material consumption. If you look at the whole world, you have 80% of the whole population, which in terms of the standard of living of advanced countries are poor. Mm. We will not say to those people, look, you have to dematerialize, and instead of having more food or more manufactured goods or more bicycles or motorcycles and cars, then you have to consume some dematerialized services. I don't think this is realistic for the moment.
No.
So I'm not sure that it is really the way to go forward.
Yeah, so it's a first world perspective, you're saying, and then, but of course it's a big discussion in now climate measurements, for instance, in the European Union, where they now talk about the just and fair transition, in which you do want to have policies which actually do not increase inequality, policies on the environmental policies that increase inequality.
Yeah, but I think that I'm not sure that inequality is really the main issue in this policy. For the moment, the real issue is how do you make the transition toward a carbon-free economy without hurting the whole population, and in particular the poor people.
Exactly.
So maybe inequality is somewhere. I would say that it's more an issue of let's make sure that we are not hurting the poorest people in those countries.
Yeah.
And there is nothing obvious in doing that. We have to understand, and this is really the big problem for those environmental policies. We have to understand if you want to transition toward a carbon-free economy, there will be a cost to be paid, and this cost will have to be paid by more or less everybody in our society. And this is what is making this transition so difficult to decide politically, because who is the government who will decide to get into this kind of policy that will hurt most people in the society?
Clear. Professor Anderson, last question for you, and then I'm going to go to Jim Suri to reflect on what he heard today. And it's a question from Mandi Astola. We talked a lot about inequality as a societal phenomenon, right? And the responses to that. But of course, your latest book is about inequality between the power relations in the firm. And Mandi Astola wants to ask you, do you think that the democratic trends in the management, sociocracy, she calls it, co-creation, co-design, these trends, can they solve the problem of unfair workplaces, or do we need more?
Well, in the United States, I don't see much of a trend. I see more and more concentration of power at the top of the corporate ladder. This is connected to the increasing prevalence of precarity at work. The fact that ordinary workers are less and less confident even of having steady hours and a stable income over time. With increasing precarity, you have to buckle down and subject yourself even more to whatever arbitrary and domination you're subjected to by whoever's cutting your paycheck that week. So I do think that we need a lot of experimentation in the American context in democratizing the workplace. I can't say exactly how that would work. There are differences between the organization of work in the United States and in Europe that we can't just immediately import policies intact that have worked in Europe. So that's why I think we have to enter many experiments to find out what could actually be effective.
Clear. I see that Professor Bourguignon also wants to respond very shortly because the time is almost up, but please.
No, very shortly. I wanted to say simply that technological change, in particular the digitization of our economies, also producing a change in the power of workers with respect to employers. And it's likely that the relationship between salaried worker and employers will change very much in the coming years because of this flexibility that is being introduced by the technology.
Clear.
It is something that we should be really very careful about.
Thank you so much for adding. Thank you so much for now. I'm going to ask Jim Suri now to join us and to ask him, well, you kickstarted this conversation. What is your reflection on what we talked about today?
Yeah, thank you very much. I heard a lot of good things, so thanks again to our guests of today. There was a great start by Anderson, and she said that we have to set the rules of the game. And I think both guests have made clear that they don't think that the current game is the optimal game. And then we have to ask a question, which game do we want to play now? And again, I think we have to play a game where we centralize the well-being of everyone, and not every human being, but the entire planet as a whole. Of course, we need more equality in order to do that. It was a difficult question for Bourguignon as well, and for me as well, to
to define the optimal level of this inequality. But I think equality goes hand in hand with freedom. And if you find an optimal way, we have to use innovation and technology in order to strive for more well-being. And we also have to make sure that in this path, we are limited by our planetary boundaries. So there was a lot of has been said about GDP, economic growth, but of course, most of the urgent problems today is that the rise of our global economic welfare is at the cost of our natural world. So if we talk about equality and freedom, it's not about how humans perceive it, but for the entire planet.
A broader perspective. Did you hear something? Because you were, of course, advocate. I also asked them. You were advocating a notion of consumption focus, and the speakers were, especially Professor Bourguignon, said, "Well, for many, in my words, a first world perspective, because 60 to 80% of the world population is still need consumption." What's your idea about that?
Yeah, well, I agree what Bourguignon said, because it's very almost arrogant to say, okay, people in Africa, they have to focus on dematerialization of our economy when their basic needs are not fulfilled. But on the other hand, in developed countries, where we have a lot of materialized economic welfare, we do have the ability to shift towards the dematerialization of our welfare.
Yeah. One of the trends that both Professor Bourguignon and Professor Anderson mentioned was the rise of the precarious work in, especially in, for example, in Europe or in America, so the Western world. Do you worry about that as well?
What exactly do you mean with that?
The rise of precarious jobs and precarious work. So
no fixed contracts, fixed hours, no
gig economy,
labor relationship, which is a bit secure.
Ah, yeah. Well, yeah. I also think that's a big problem as well. And I think that's an effect of the rise of inequality defined by power. So I also said in the introduction statement that freedom of the one does not have to lead to less freedom of the other. And I think this is an effect of that point.
Okay, thank you so much. I would like to also thank Professor Bourguignon, Professor Anderson for joining this conversation in rethinking, reimagining capitalism. Of course, I have a list of questions which is 5 pages long, and of course, all sentences you spoke were actually creating all these new questions which we cannot discuss in this short period of time. But thank you so much for joining us. We will continue this conversation, especially on, of course, precarious situations in developing countries and the responsibility for richer countries next week, because we have Mohammed Yunus and Jeffrey Sachs with us. But it's very important for you, because we're going to pre-record that session because of the time difference with Bangladesh. If you want to join us, you should write an email to julia@dezwijger.nl, because then we're going to invite you especially to ask questions to Mr. Sachs or Mr. Yunus. Julia@dezwijger.nl if you want to live join the conversation. Otherwise, it's pre-recorded and you'll just see the result at the same time we normally show this live cast. So I hope you will join us next week. We will focus on aligning economies to end poverty, a next topic in our research. For today, I thank you for watching and asking all these brilliant questions. And Eveline Verhagen, I'm so honored you visited us for all events. Thank you for doing that. And hope I see all of you next week. Thank you.